I thought my son was dead for 20 years, until he knocked on my door. My heart nearly stopped when I heard that late-night knock on the door. It was just past midnight, and I was alone in the house, just me and Rusty, our old golden retriever asleep on the rug. The sound made my hands tremble. After 20 years of waking up to an empty home, I actually froze. When I fumbled for the light switch and opened the door, I recognized those familiar brown eyes instantly. He stood there, 20 years older but unmistakably him, my son. Even in the dim porch light, I could see the same crooked smile, the same slight gap between his front teeth. The face of a boy I thought I'd never see again. "Dad," he whispered. It was quieter than I expected, but it was his voice, my boy's voice. I closed the door behind him without thinking and just stared. My chest felt like it was going to burst. "It can't be you," I choked out. My own voice sounded foreign, but I managed to force it out. He nodded, a tiny, hopeful motion. Tears welled in my eyes so fast I thought they might spill onto his shirt. He stepped across the threshold. I barely even moved. I just watched him come inside as if I were in some kind of waking dream. The house smelled the same as it always had. Old furniture polish and the faint hint of Rusty's dog food. Everything looked just like I remembered. His dusty old toy car still sat on the shelf, and the drawing of a rocket ship taped to the wall above the fireplace smiled back at me. It was the same rocket he'd drawn when he was 3, on the night before we went camping. I hadn't had the heart to throw it away. He looked like a stranger and like my son all at once. He was tall now, almost as tall as I am, with broad shoulders and clean-cut hair, but his eyes were the same warm brown. When he smiled sheepishly and scratched the back of his neck, I saw that nervous boy who used to worry about doing poorly on his math homework. "Hi, Dad," he finally said. I swallowed hard. Yes, it is you, Mike," I managed to say. I was using his name like I hadn't stopped saying it in all those empty years. He flinched a bit. I guess he wasn't used to being called Mike. I tried the pet name he'd grown up with. "Hey, buddy," I whispered. He grinned softly. "Hi, buddy," he answered quietly, tears glistening in his eyes. My knees felt weak. Come in," I said, stepping aside. I felt like I was floating. 20 years of locked-up grief rushed through me. Shock, disbelief, and the purest joy I had ever known, all at once. He walked past me and took off his shoes. The house was quiet but for the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. I closed the door and leaned against it, steadying myself. What? My words kept sticking in my throat. Finally, I asked, "Where have you been? All these years?" He sat down on the couch and I perched on the edge of the armchair opposite him. He looked around as if trying to decide where to start. His gaze landed on the photo I kept on the mantel. The one of me and him at the beach when he was 5, grinning with a big chocolate ice cream mustache. "Dad," he started, voice shaking a little. "I'm so sorry. I know this sounds insane." His eyes found mine. "I know you were told I died in the accident." A raw wave of pain hit me. I remembered everything. The sound of the twisted metal, the flashing lights, the policeman kneeling by the roadside while a paramedic cupped my face in their hands. "They told me you were gone," I rasped, looking down at my hands clenched tight. "At the funeral, I had an empty casket, Mike. I knew it wasn't you, but everyone told me." I knew it wasn't you, but everyone told me it was. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I remember that funeral. I was there, Dad. I watched you say goodbye to me." My breath caught. "What?" I looked at him, horrified. You were at the funeral?" He swallowed, Yeah, after the crash, I woke up in a hospital with no memory of who I was. I had been hit by a car on a sidewalk a few days later. They found me lying there, unconscious. I had your old address in my phone, so I ended up being taken to the same hospital. I shook my head. It was all so much I was struggling to take it in. So you had an accident and ended up at that hospital too. He nodded. Yeah, they thought I was you. His voice cracked. I was wearing your t-shirt, and I had your wallet in my pocket from that day. When I couldn't remember anything, they figured I must have died in your car. My fist slammed lightly on the arm of my chair. So I believed you were dead, but it was you? He blinked away more tears. In their eyes, I was. I left your house after I recovered enough, and I ended up living with a woman named Karen. She was kind. She had lost her son long ago, and she didn't want to give me up when I started asking questions. I never even had a chance to try to come find you, Dad. I honestly thought I was living someone else's life. I fought the tide of emotion. I raised hell back then, I whispered. I hired private detectives. I begged the police to search that crash site again. All I ever wanted was a sign you were alive, Mike. Even when I was alone at home, I'd set an extra plate at dinner just out of hope. He covered my hand with his. I know, Dad. I let that sink in and finally spoke again. So you found out the truth when? He took a deep breath. Bit by bit, I started remembering things. A memory here, a photo there. When I turned 18, I borrowed some money and bought a bus ticket to our old town. I wanted to just stand outside the house and see if any part of me felt right. And Dad, it did. I felt like I should be on this porch. I nodded slowly. That was last week before you finally knocked. He smiled weakly. Yeah, I nearly chickened out 1,000 times. We both laughed through our tears. The silence that fell after was warm and full of understanding. I realized how I had never given him up in my heart, and he realized I had never stopped waiting for him. I asked the question I'd lived with for 20 years. Why didn't you find me? He looked down. I was scared, Dad. Scared you'd hate me for leaving. Scared that maybe you had moved on or I'd changed so much. My chest squeezed at that. I was scared too, I admitted. Scared I'd never see you again. I squeezed his hand. But I'm here now. That evening was unbelievable. After letting the shock settle in, we talked until dawn. He told me about Karen and how she had taken him in as one of her own. I told him about the woman he'd never gotten to meet, my mom, who I had to keep believing was waiting for him in some dream. I told him the truth. For 20 years, I had spent every birthday alone, believing you were gone. I'd carried your tattered drawings in a shoebox. I'd refused to throw out your toothbrush. And I swore every night to God that if by some miracle you walked back through that door, I would never let you go again. He listened, holding my hand, letting me pour out all the sorrow I had kept locked away. I admitted to him the little lies I told myself, like hiding in your bedroom at night, imagining you were there asleep. I explained the anger I had felt toward that deer on the road and how I'd even cussed at the guardrail that night. By the time I finished, I was sobbing quietly. He wrapped me in a hug, soft and real, and whispered, "It wasn't your fault, Dad." The next days were a blur of joy and adjustment. We did all the things we used to do together. In the morning, we made pancakes with blueberries, your favorite, and sat at the old kitchen table laughing over spilled syrup. We even fell into old routines, going to get gas in my truck and quibbling over whether to swing by the market. It felt eerie but wonderful, like waking up from a nightmare. The empty seat at my table was finally filled again. One morning we drove to the police station together. The detective who handled my case was shocked to see you. We sat in that dull interview room as he confirmed by DNA that you were indeed my son. He was apologizing over and over for the mix-up, but we just laughed and said it was okay. Outside, you joked that you could refuse our bureaucracy a favor for once. Then we went to the old diner, the one where we used to celebrate your last birthday together. The owner recognized you instantly from the photo behind the counter. 20 years ago, after the funeral, he had slipped me a stack of blueberry pancakes when I broke down in an empty booth. Now he did the same for you, placing 2 plates on our table with big smiles. For a moment, I felt like everything had turned right again. Life slowly started to feel normal. You helped me clean out your old bedroom. Thick dust billowed out when we opened the door, but you laughed as you found your tiny dinosaur collection and proudly set them back on the shelf. We updated all your records, new driver's license, social security info, even a new school transcript. Everywhere we went, people reacted the same way: astonishment and tears. The high school principal, who's been retired 2 decades, came by the school parking lot the next day and just stood there rubbing his eyes when he saw you. We settled into a new routine as father and son. We drove out to the lake one afternoon, just the 2 of us. You hadn't been there since you were 8, but it was like you'd never been away. You cast a fishing line off the dock and caught the first fish before I did. You threw your head back and laughed, the exact same way you used to. My heart felt so full it could burst. Your 31st birthday came a month later. I actually enjoyed planning a party for it. We invited some of the old neighbors and even some new friends you'd made at your job. We ate too much cake. You got a jersey of the basketball team you loved as a kid, and when the candles were blown out, I realized I hadn't cried once that day, only smiled all the way through. In the quiet moments now, I find myself frequently reaching for the phone to call you, just like old times. When I walk through the rooms of my house, I see traces of the story we lived. The empty corner where your swing set stood, now replaced by a potted plant you wanted. The little figurine on my mantle you gave me for Father's Day back when you were 5, now finally dusted and shining again. Some days it still feels surreal. I catch myself doing a double take when I walk in and see you sitting on the porch steps. I pinch myself when I find you here, in your pajamas and sneakers, sipping coffee like we do almost every Sunday. We're just 2 ordinary guys now, joking about our day, watching sports on TV, playing catch in the driveway until the sunset. But we never take it for granted, not even for a second. I won't lie, I still have nightmares sometimes. One especially vivid dream kept coming back. I'm at the bedside of a young boy, whispering to him to wake up. But lately, I haven't woken in the middle of the night to find myself on the edge of that hospital bed. Instead, every morning I wake up to you telling me there's bacon on the stove and why I slept through my alarm again. We talk about everything now. The life you missed is filling out around you. You've talked about going to school for engineering, just like you once dreamed. I've signed you up for community college courses and helped you fill out scholarship forms. Yes, I'm still that guy who checks your homework. You brighten every time you talk about building things. Your real passion is cars and engines, and I can't wait to see where that leads you. Meanwhile, I finally quit that accounting job I hated. I figured a dad should spend his golden years on the porch with his son, not on the train to an office job. Now I occupy myself fixing up the garden you used to plant seeds in, and trusting you to tell me exactly how not to break the lawnmower when I inevitably try to help too. On long afternoons, we'll sit by that same lake we went to after the accident. We don't need to talk. Neither of us feels awkward. We just look out at the water. I feel a peace there I didn't know I could feel again. The 2-decade void I carried is healing slowly. The ache isn't gone, but it's now a gentle reminder of the miracle I live each day. Every day I make sure he knows he's home. Sometimes that means just passing him the ketchup at dinner or nudging him awake for church. But other times, when I catch his eye across the room or see him walking up the porch steps, I force myself to stop and really see him, the man he has become, who once was the little boy I tucked into bed. I say quietly, "You're home now. I love you." He always smiles and puts an arm around my shoulders. "Love you too, Dad," he says, and it always feels like enough. That knock on the door changed everything. For 20 years, I thought I had lost the most important part of myself. Then one ordinary night, fate decided to set things right. And now I know I was never really alone, and miracles can happen. All the questions I had ended up answered in the most beautiful way. Sometimes I still look out our front window when he's not home, half expecting to see him walk up with that same shy grin of his. But I don't worry about it anymore. He's sitting right beside me. After all these years of emptiness, my house is full again, and my heart is finally at peace. And as long as I have breath in my body, I will never, ever let him go again. That first week after he returned felt like waking into a world with the color turned up. The ordinary things, coffee steam curling from mugs, keys on the hook, the feel of a hand on the kitchen counter as we washed dishes together, felt sharper, more precious. I wrote a list on the inside of an old recipe book titled "Do Not Forget," and on it I scrawled, "Call the dentist, sign up for driver's permit, get new glasses, take a photo for the town paper." The town paper, I realized, would never believe this story without proof. We checked off small boxes like soldiers reclaiming land. The detective who had closed the old case was a man of habit. He came over on a Tuesday with a folder of paperwork and an apology that folded into itself like an old, weary map. We sat at my kitchen table on mismatched chairs, Rusty snoring at our feet, while he explained the slow, bureaucratic mechanics of mistakes made in the aftermath of chaos. Misfiled IDs, similar names, a hospital with an overflow of patients, and an overworked staff. There was no malice, he said. Only error. His hands trembled when he handed the paperwork to my son. It was as if the man had spent 20 years apologizing in private and finally had to say it into the open. We accepted his apology not because it erased anything, but because there was no use in keeping our hands clenched on grudges we didn't want to feed. Forgiveness felt like a practical thing, an act that freed us to build whatever came next, rather than letting us excavate past wounds every morning. My son said nothing dramatic. He simply looked at the detective and nodded, which meant more than any grand pronouncement. Karen arrived a few evenings later with a dish that tasted like being held, stew thick enough to carve with a spoon, warm bread, and a quiet presence that felt like an extra chair at a table set long ago. She was shorter than I'd expected, with hands that had worked and eyes that had learned too much kindness. She hummed while she handed us bowls and told small stories about odd jobs and strange neighbors, and the way the town's winter had been stubborn that year. When I asked why she had not tried to make us meet sooner, her answer was simple. She had a man at her table who had been pulled from the world, and at first she feared if she pushed him back, he might fall again. She had loved him into being, and sometimes, she said, the people who love us most make the decisions that feel safest in the moment. We all cried a little, too much perhaps, but the kind of crying that unseals a house and lets air in. Karen and Mike hugged in a way that suggested a debt owed and repaid in the currency of quiet gratitude. She sat with us as we told the story, my telling of the funeral, his telling of the hospital wakefulness, and her hurting of the days between. Her presence, like a steady hand on the back of a chair, helped hold the new world steady while we learned where to place furniture. Days blurred into a pattern of forms and phone calls. There were practical details that anchored the surreal in the mundane, signing paperwork at the social services office, waiting in line for the driver's permit number to be called, the feel of the side of a pencil while filling out an affidavit. Each signature felt like a stitch in a garment we were hurriedly sewing to fit lives that had been altered beyond recognition. He talked to lawyers about identity documents, those bureaucratic talismans that prove your place in the world. He talked to counselors about memory and grief, about the odd sensation of returning to a life he had thought was another man's. There were moments, even in the days of paperwork, that made me laugh until I couldn't breathe. He forgot my birthday at first, an irony I could have screamed at. So we celebrated it anyway on a Tuesday with takeout and a slightly lopsided birthday cake bought at the bakery that always put too much frosting on the edges. He made a terrible lasagna that burned the top but tasted like triumph. He took Rusty for walks and came back with stories about neighbors I'd not seen in years, and treats he'd bought the dog because he felt the world owed him small compensations. During one long afternoon in the garage, elbow deep in a carburetor he insisted was fixable with patience and duct tape, he told me about the peculiar loneliness of pretending. I would listen to people talk about who I was supposed to be, he said, wiping grease with the hem of a shirt. And I'd nod along because it was warmer than saying I didn't remember. He had learned accents, mannerisms, the cadence of stories because it kept him safe from the investigation of strangers. It's exhausting, he said, and shameful sometimes. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw the boy who'd been taught to swallow his fear rather than shout it. Shame doesn't stick to you, buddy, I said, because if I didn't speak it aloud, I might let him carry it alone. It's something people hand you when they don't know what else to do. He gave a small half-smile and kept working. Later, when the carburetor coughed back to life, we cheered like boys at a schoolyard accomplishment. The town had its rituals, and folks were quick to make up their minds, some in sympathetic awe, others with the thin crust of suspicion. The local paper ran a piece with our photograph, an old man and the young man everyone had assumed forever lost. People called the house at odd hours, wanting a piece of the miracle. A woman from a church group dropped off a box of homemade cookies and an offer to help with anything you might need. A man I'd worked with 30 years earlier stopped by and spoke about fate and chances, as if penning the right phrase could make sense of 20 years. My son handled fame with a blush and a joke, deflecting any sudden celebrity with the same self-effacing humor that had always endeared him to people. We took slow field trips into the past. We drove by his elementary school, which had a fresh coat of paint and a playground that creaked the same way it always had. We stopped at the old corner store where, when he was small, he used to spend his allowance on a single candy bar. The owner, who was now an older man with a voice like gravel, pressed a small bag of penny candies into his hand and said, "Welcome back, son." The way people returned pieces of us, small tokens, stories, the echo of memory, made the town feel less like it had been waiting and more like it had simply kept a light on. There was one quiet afternoon when we drove out to the place where the accident had been reported. I remember the way the road lay like a ribbon between fields, the guardrail still bent a little as if bearing the memory of impact. We walked in silence for a long while. He bent down and found a coin in the dirt, a copper piece worn smooth, and handed it to me like a talisman. "Weird little artifacts," he said with a shrug. "I like them." I pocketed the coin as if it would carry the days we'd missed. Over time, small triumphs built up like stones in a path. He enrolled in a couple of evening classes at the community college, basic math and shop work, and came home with homework like a child bringing home treasures. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and pretended I wasn't a mind reader, letting him puzzle through equations until the pieces snapped into place. He was a slow student in some ways, and brilliant in others. Hands that had been taught to coax life from machines found algebra oddly like a small engine that needed coaxing. He took a job at a local garage, sweeping floors at first, then changing oil, then standing upright with a wrench like a man who finally knew where his hands belonged. Karen visited sometimes, and the three of us would sit on the porch in long stretches of afternoon sun. She would tell stories of the first nights she'd stayed awake with him, of how she used to sing old songs while he slept, as if music could reorder the memory misplaced inside him. There were awkward moments, old lovers' names that surfaced in dreams and had us all pausing like skiers on the crest of a hill. But we learned to navigate those. Karen had given her heart to someone who had nearly disappeared. She deserved a place at our table beyond being a rescuer. She became a friend, then more, a figure in our life with a history stitched to ours by care. There were also the nights I'd wake with my chest tight and the shape of an empty hospital room on my mind. Sometimes I'd find myself reaching toward the side table to touch the space where a boy once slept, then flinching when it was just a folded blanket. He would come out into the hallway when he heard my restlessness and sit with me in the dark. "Bad dream?" he'd ask, simple and direct. I'd nod, and he'd say quietly, "We're here now." It was enough. Small human succor that made the world make sense again. Months passed, then a year. Routine grew like ivy, slow and unstoppable. We built rituals: Sunday breakfast, a Saturday run to the flea market where he liked to haggle for tools, a Wednesday movie night where we argued about the best actor from the 80s. Every ritual tied us together tighter. He signed up to take an engineering fundamentals course, and I watched with something that felt like grandchildren's pride as he tackled a calculus problem until his lips were white with focus. He also began to find pieces of himself in surprising places. A scent, someone's cologne, the smell of motor oil, a whiff of peppermint from a candy wrapper, would unlock a memory like a key in a rusty lock. Sometimes the memories came fast and bright. A summer where he had learned to ride a bike without training wheels, the exact slap of a baseball in the palm of a glove. Sometimes they were maddeningly fragmentary. The flash of a face without a name, a childhood home that felt right but could not be placed on a map. We colored in the missing spaces together, trading stories and photos. He would stare long at old pictures and ask questions that made me feel like a time traveler telling tales about a past that had been both suffered and survived. There were times when outsiders misunderstood the shape of our reunion. An acquaintance suggested gently that maybe there were legal complications, that identity theft or fraud might be involved. A few nosy townsfolk whispered about how someone could vanish and return. We learned to close our doors against speculation and to open them wider for the people who mattered. Once, when a reporter rang the bell and asked for a quick interview about miraculous homecomings, my son politely declined. "We don't want a circus," he said. He did not seem to relish the spotlight, and I was proud of him for claiming shelter over spectacle. Over the years that followed, we made plans for small things and bigger dreams. He talked about learning to weld properly, about applying for apprenticeship programs that would teach him to build engines and machines. I promised to drive him to interviews and to stand in the waiting room with my hands folded, heart thudding like a drum. He started to make friends at work, men and women who knew cars and motors and the world of grease-stained satisfaction. They took to him because he worked hard and because he was kind in a practical way, offering an extra pair of hands when someone needed them. There were holidays we celebrated twice over. The first anniversary of his return, we sat around the table with neighbors and a cake that said, "Welcome home" in frosting. I'd learned to write better than I had in my youth. We invited people who had been kind and people who had been patient. We told the story, never too many details, only enough to let others understand the shape of our miracle. And we listened as other people told us about their own losses and recoveries. That first birthday we celebrated felt like more than just candles on a cake. It was an altar to the strange generosity of life. Time is a gentle teacher. It taught us how to make room for the absent years without pretending they had not occurred. It taught us to be tender with each other's scars. There were disagreements, like any people who live together. About bills, about whose turn it was to clean the gutters, about whether the dog deserved one more treat. We argued sometimes as men do, with too much pride and not enough softness, and then we made up as parents and sons have across the ages by fixing a meal and washing a shirt. I learned to let him fail sometimes, the small failures that teach him how to be a man who can cope, while he learned to let me help without annoyance. And the town, which at first had been a theater of astonishment, began to fold our story into its ordinary fabric. People stopped asking for explanations and began to invite us to picnics and card games and to borrow tools. They let us be a family again in easy, human ways. The principal from the high school came by once with a dusty yearbook and a handshake, and we leafed through pictures of boys in shirts, 2 sizes too small big, and smiles that didn't yet know the weight of absence. We laughed and remembered. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, we would sit on the porch with Rusty at our feet and talk about the future in the casual way men who have been given second chances often do. He wanted to enroll in a trade school and maybe, one day, open a small shop where he could fix engines and hearts with equal patience. I dreamed, a little selfishly, of lazy mornings and afternoons spent fixing the porch, of teaching him how to prune the roses and keep watch over the vegetable patch. We planned small voyages, trips to the coast and to the fairs where he used to eat cotton candy and insist on winning me a prize he would then give back to me. Years folded into a new normal. The house smelled of oil and bread, of coffee and cedar. I retired properly from the job I had once kept. No more early trains and the pressure of numbers. Instead, I took up woodworking as a hobby that allowed my hands to do what my heart had wanted all along, to make beautiful, sturdy things. He came with me to buy tools and would stand by my side as we measured and hammered and argued about the right length of a board. We built a workbench together, making mistakes and undoing them, and making jokes about who would be the one to sand until the sunrise caught the edges just right. When Rusty's fur finally thinned and his back legs grew stiff, we tended him like the family elder he had been. He passed on a late winter afternoon, curled at our feet in his favorite spot by the fireplace. We buried him beneath the maple tree in the yard and planted lavender over his grave. For the first time in 20 years, I did not feel the need to be stoic. We cried together, then shared memories about the way he used to chase his own shadow. The grief was sharp, but the presence of my son made it bearable. The years taught me to celebrate small mercies. I learned to enjoy the grain of wood and the comfort of a steady hand. My son learned to be patient with his lapses and more gracious with himself. We learned the art of listening, the quiet craft of letting someone tell a story and then holding it with care rather than correcting it. We built a life in the spaces gravity had left open, a life punctuated by family dinners, the clatter of tools, the occasional argument, and the deep rest of being known. On the 20th anniversary of that strange reunion, we marked it not with a monument, but with a small picnic by the lake. We spread a blanket and ate the kind of sandwiches he used to insist on, peanut butter and jam, crusts included. We invited Karen and a few neighbors and some folks from the garage. We laughed, remembered, and then were quiet so we could hear the water move over stones. He looked out over the lake and said simply, "I don't know how to thank you." I took his hand and answered, "You don't need to. Just being here is thanks enough." He smiled in a way that made his eyes crinkle like the child in old photographs. Time did not erase the mystery of what had happened in those lost years. There were aspects we never understood, the exact trajectory of the hospital's misidentification, the nights when he could not remember the names of his closest friends, the holes that memory left like windows without glass. But mysteries and silence are part of being human. I decided, slowly and deliberately, to be content with the fact that not everything must be explained to be loved. Love is not a ledger that requires receipts. It is a quiet practice of presence. Every now and then, I would walk through the house and run my fingers along the bookshelf where his childhood books sat. I would take down a tattered copy of a book we'd read together and feel the weight of its pages like a talisman. He would come in and watch me with a grin and say, "You're getting soft, Dad." I would laugh and return the grin, thinking, fantastically, that maybe I was. For 20 years, I carried an ache in my chest that felt like a house with a missing window. The knock at midnight was the first gust that carried a patch of warmth into that room. Since then, we have been patching and repainting, adding curtains, replanting the garden. The house is not new, but it is full again. The light comes in through that window now, and when it does, I see my son walking in the yard and the shadow of Rusty chasing the light. And when I say at the end of the day, like I always did when he was small, "Good night, buddy," I do so with a gratitude that cannot be measured. He answers, "Love you too, Dad," and it is enough. It is everything.